we don't even really need this slide because we've all been through it the past couple of years. So the struggle is real. What we're hearing from churches right now is that it's challenging to balance, do the hybrid thing, online and in person. Energy is down. Nationally, they're documenting that some people just aren't making it back to church. And then it's harder to get volunteers to recruit people to do regular tasks. So people are saying, I'm kind of tired, I need a little bit of a break. Some new divisions between people and some old ones as well. So it's a fairly divided time in our country, but also finding that in at least some congregations. And just people are stressed and tired. So adding in, try to do school with your kids online, not online. You know, I find parents have an extra layer of stress during this time. So we wanted to hear from you if you're willing to tell us. Maybe you sit and think about your struggle all day and you'd rather not write it in the chat box. But like, what's a struggle you face at your church right now, if you're willing to share that in the chat?
While Joy is talking, I'm reading and learning about you. So we have Graham who learned long ago the importance of listening and interested in how this can be helpful in present and developing circumstances. And I appreciate that word developing because everything keeps changing. And that's one of the values of listening, is that what we thought we knew yesterday may not be true today, and it probably won't be true tomorrow. Low numbers of attendance, that's like Joy said, that's something a lot of people are experiencing. And that's both fewer people actually in the building because of COVID and people who just never came back to participating in person, but then also maybe some changes in who is part of the church, even online in a hybrid environment. For example, we've had some people in our church who had drifted away from in-person attendance, but then started participating regularly online, and vice versa. Some people who used to be very active and are no longer. So inconsistent attendance, sometimes people attend, sometimes don't, not getting a clear sense of why.
Yeah, I think that was happening before COVID, and that COVID has accelerated that trend.
Yeah.
Well, now hearing from a lot of churches that regular participation or being an active member means coming every 2 to 3 weeks, not every week. So in many people's minds. Thanks for those comments. So what we're advocating for is a pause for intentional and prayerful listening in your congregation. So it's almost like taking a breath. And I think we particularly need this right now because circumstances are different. And so our responses and our approaches need to be different. And the best way to land on a really great approach is to listen to the people in your congregation.
So we talk about intentional listening. We wanted to take a little bit of time to define what we mean by that. So when we're talking about it in this context, we mean specific activities designed to hear from people in the congregation. So that's a time and a place and a space. And when we say by space, we mean both physical space, but then also space where it's not like you're supposed to be doing something else. So that's what we mean by taking a breath or taking a pause, and where people know that this is a time where it's okay for me to open up and talk about myself. Sometimes people don't feel comfortable talking about themselves. that it's safe, that there's some structure and some guidelines, and that people know that they'll be heard. And it also means tracking. So this is intentional listening, intentional. Part of it is gathering information. So we also talk about the importance of listening just in general, that it's good to become better listeners in every aspect of our life. But here we're talking about listening that has a learning component to it, which means that in some form, what's being shared is being recorded. Oh, I like the face. And finally, it means having a mindset that listening is doing something. And this might actually be the hardest, because we sometimes put action, programs, doing ministry on one side of the seesaw, and then kind of touchy-feely listening, ooey-gooey relational stuff on the other side. And it might feel like, well, if we're struggling to get people involved, we're struggling to get people active, like why would we want to take a pause and get people even further back? But actually thinking about listening as ministry work. It's active. That's why they say active listening. So listening is doing something. So these are the different ways that we believe that listening can energize a congregation. And so we're going to hear these themes kind of over and over again, but just in summary, that listening brings ownership. And I want you to think back to a time when somebody asked your opinion about something, somebody wanted your feedback. And if I think about that in my life, I know that the things that I feel like when I've had my hand in it, when somebody cared enough to ask me my opinion, I have a connection to that. So if somebody's asking me my opinion about the church, what animates me, where are my passions, what are my needs, how can the church better connect with me? Even if there's nothing immediate that comes from that, just the act of asking can inspire greater involvement and a sense of ownership. It also builds connection with one another. So some of the activities we talk about get people talking to one another in the church. And also the team that's doing the listening, they build bonds with people through their listening. You learn about gifts and needs in the church that you may have no idea were there. So people who have, just one really quick example, sitting across from somebody in the church and discovering that they had all this travel experience, that they had been a missionary. I never knew that about them. And so now there's this whole world of things that I can talk to them about. And likewise, giving people permission to talk about their needs that they don't necessarily want to come out and say, but here's a space where you learn about what people need in the church. And then finally, it energizes because it lifts to the surface people's ideas and what they're energized about, and that opens the door to new possibilities for ministry. We have biblical precedents, so all throughout. So we know in the ministry of Jesus, we see him over and over again asking questions. So Jesus is the great teacher, but Jesus is also the great listener. And that was part of his ministry.
I wanted to say about how listening energizes a couple slides back. I saw this in my own ministry life at my church. I've been doing special events, and we've been doing them all outside during COVID, and just doing fun events. We did Blessing of the Animals back in the fall around St. Francis's feast day. But we have about 30% of our congregation is Karen, so they are an immigrant group from Burma, or Myanmar as it's called now. And they have a special holiday celebration on December 1st called Sweet December. So they actually ring in the birth month of Jesus. So we wanted to do an outdoor holiday event for people in our church to participate in. So I went to their Sunday school group. They have their own group, the Karendu, on Sunday morning. And I said, what is Sweet December and how do you celebrate it? So they talked to me about it, the kinds of food. They often have balloons, they play games, there's dancing. They like to sing certain kinds of songs. And I said, well, what should we do to celebrate that well with you, as the Anglo people in the congregation? And so that we talked about that. We had a conversation, and they attended the event. Like, there were more current people at that event than I've seen at church in a really long time. So we did that the first weekend of December. It was actually like 32 degrees here in Minnesota, which is, kind of springtime weather. So there were about 30 Karen people. They brought their families, and about 30 Anglo people. So it was truly this, combo event where there was strong participation from both groups. So when is a good time for listening? It's always is the right answer. But especially, so we've identified some things, sometimes where you really want to do some listening. So if you feel stuck or out of energy, and I think many of us feel that way right now, it's been feeling like that at my church. So I'm hoping that we'll engage in some listening. But yeah, this is like mud season in Vermont, and the truck is stuck. This is a very sad photo when things that used to work aren't working. And I think many of us are finding that at church. One thing I'm telling people to pay attention to is that, some of us had to stop doing certain ministries, certain kinds of ministries during COVID. And if nobody missed them, maybe it's time to take a look at not starting them up again. So I think that when this happens, I think it's a sign, and it could be a time when you can say, well, maybe we need to stop that and look at getting some ideas for some new things that we could do. And if people aren't really talking to each other, I think that's a good time to do some intentional listening. So if you do group listening sessions, large group, or if you do some smaller focus groups, people who don't know each other well can really connect. And we'll talk some more in a minute about the kinds of questions that you can give people to ask each other. And that can really help them learn about each other, but also help them express what they'd like to see happen at church. And if there's a lot bubbling under the surface, so this could be ideas or passion, like people start talking about something they really want to address in the church. So, in certain church, I've been on the staff of 2 churches, and at one where I worked at, we ended up starting a legal clinic for the community because people kept talking to me about that. It was just like this idea that was bubbling, and the people that talked to me about it didn't necessarily even know each other. And so we ended up pulling those people together and getting a legal clinic started. Or it might be conflict, which isn't a negative, or disagreement that's bubbling under there, misunderstanding. So if you're sensing that in your congregation, I think it's also a really good time to do some intentional listening. And if your church is dealing with change or crisis, and I think all congregations would fall into this category right now, I picked out a photo of an avalanche because I feel like there's, it's blocking forward progress. Like there's a real roadblock here, and like lots of different kinds of rocks and size of rocks. I feel like we were maybe hit with 4 or 5 things, or maybe more in your case, during the past couple of years. And I would say, we talk about change. So, changing pastors, bringing in a new pastoral leader is a change where that's a good time to do some listening. If you're looking to start up new ministries, that's this next slide. So, I often do listening like this with strategic planning and visioning, just to capture what people see is the church right now. Like, this is who we've been, this is our identity, and what do we hope to become in the future. But if you're looking at going in a new direction with certain kind of ministry, like I often see youth ministries do listening like this with the kids and their volunteers and with parents, just to get strong feedback on needs and interests. So in youth ministry, it's now become more common to have the students actually leading pieces of the ministry to sort of find out what they're good at, what their passions are, and then to kind of let them run with it. So what we're really talking about is, making listening a habit in your congregation. So not saying, oh, these 2 weeks of the year, we're going to listen real hard, and then we're not going to listen again until next year at this time. So really kind of folding it into the church calendar. So, like leading up to annual meetings might really be a good time to do some listening, or at the start of a new year. I wondered about it as part of Lent. So we do self-reflection as part of Lent. And do Moravians celebrate Lent? I forgot to ask. Okay. Now I've been an Episcopalian for a while, so I assume everyone celebrates or participates in Lent. But we do self-reflection as part of Lent. And maybe it's time to do some reflection on our ministries at church and to think about those also. Right before summer, I find might be a good time to, here in Minnesota, people kind of check out during the summer because we have to go outside during the 3 months of summer because it's cold the rest of the year. So we actually end a lot, like I think our youth group ministry at our church ended at the end of April last year. So I thought, hey, like maybe the first week of May or first couple of weeks of May, we do some listening. So, and I don't think it has to be complicated or time consuming to do listening either. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but we're not talking about something that's gonna, filling out 10-page forms, or, ideally you kind of fold them into all the activities that you do each year. Maybe people just get used to being at an event and having, a couple of questions that they're reflecting on and talking to the people at their table about, for example. So it's really, we're talking about a culture shift. So you're weaving in lots of opportunities for people in the congregation to share with one another. So maybe the listening thread is the purple one. It's kind of mixed in there with all the other threads. So wondering what, based on what I said, what's a good time for listening? Do any of these descriptions of a good time for listening apply to your church? And when might be a good time to build listening into your church calendar? You could put those in the chat box. I think of other times that I've done. Or summer before beginning a new Sunday school year. Okay, so summer is a good time for Carolyn's church. Yeah, Rebecca's wondering if we could connect this to special high holy days in the church calendar. Yeah, I like it. So
yeah.
In the Episcopal Church, we have ordinary time. I kind of hate that. And the color is green. I like the color. But so anyway, I always think, let's make ordinary time extraordinary time. Want to make that like a little motto. So.
And you can do different types of listening at different times. Maybe Joy touched on this, but so you don't have to like do all of your listening in one big bang. You can spread it out and plan, okay, at this time, we're like before the Sunday school year, we're going to talk to families. Maybe before Easter, we're going to listen to where people are spiritually. So connect it with the life of your church.
I would say to, as I was working with churches during COVID, the churches that actually asked people what they wanted and needed during this time, I think did better on trying to implement the COVID restrictions or opening up than churches that didn't ask those questions or ask for input from people. So I would put that in there too. I think this was a hard situation at church to have stuff kind of land on you suddenly. I think it was better to have a dialogue about what was happening. And ultimately, pastors are in the difficult position of having to make decisions about the safety of the group and things. It's a hard role to have to play, but I think getting at least people feeling heard was helpful during this time. So
Arnaldo shared creating opportunities and expressing interest perhaps after church services or social events if COVID permits. So building listening onto times when people are already gathered together. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that with some examples later on. So yes. And then Graham, I really appreciate what you wrote. When there's a death in the congregation, listening to the family and to each other as we share what the person has meant in the life of the congregation and to us personally.
Amen. That's really
yeah.
beautiful.
You know, we do that for people. We think when there's a memorial service, this is just what happens naturally. We talk about what that person meant to us, tell stories about their life. And we can do that for, I don't want to say the death, but the passing of church programs or seasons as well. So if you're needing to make a transition, say you've had a ministry that's been going on for a long time, but its time is over and you have to move on, or you just, for various reasons, you're ending a program, to have a time of listening where people can talk about what that program meant to them, tell stories about it, because it's really a form of grieving. Or I mean, this is true. A church that was doing some renovations, and they decided to get rid of their organ. And everybody knows when you have a church organ, it is holy ground. And it caused a lot of contention, but they had a listening service where people could share what that organ had meant to them, tell stories about, getting married, and to the march, organ music marching them down the aisle, and having that time to grieve and to say it's okay to be sad about this is a loss. We're not just going to rip it up and have it be gone from your lives. That actually brought the level of heat around that transition down.
Yeah. Michael says, my congregation needs special occasions, dedicated weekends to engage in this kind of conversation. It's really good to know that. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And so for retreats are a wonderful time to do listening because you're all stuck together. You can't run off from hard conversations.
Heather's saying maybe listen and be removed from where you always meet, listen in a new space that carries no memories.
That's a powerful thing. That's a powerful suggestion, Heather. And always when you take people out of their usual space, it jostles things and gives people permission to say things that maybe they wouldn't otherwise. For me, it's when I'm on a long car trip with somebody and, it's dark and we're driving and all kinds of things come out. And it's kind of like I wouldn't necessarily say if I was just sitting across from them across the desk. And so even just going out to dinner with a group that you've known for a long time, going someplace new or going for a walk can free up people to say things.
Well, I'm thinking about what Heidi was saying about time to grieve, what Graham said. Our church went through a really difficult time with a pastor who did not fit with us at all, and it was devastating. And we actually had a service of lament. People were able to write in, comments of a certain, and the staff wove it into a liturgy. And there was very little editing of the comments, and people were mature about it. They weren't making accusations or anything in what they wrote, but they were writing about their feelings, like how it made them feel when these things happen and what was the hardest. And so, I mean, I think that's another kind of listening, like people were able to share in writing anonymously, and then it was put together into the service. It was very powerful.
I think
so
anytime when there's big emotions, grief, we also want to celebrate when something is new is born or when there's a big conflict. One of my relatives' church went through a time where they had to deal with leaders who had some unacceptable behavior and had to leave the church. And there was a segment that wanted to move on as quickly as possible and thought that was the best way to heal. But they had a designated time of listening. And it wasn't a big group thing. It was sometimes when you have these big emotions, it might be better to break it up into small groups. And so talking to a few people at a time and allowing them to share their feelings, not necessarily what they thought should be done, because that's different, but just to share how they were feeling about what was going on and how this had affected their life, their experiences.
Yep.
Too often the conversations we need to have take place in passing, in the parking lot, hallway, etc. Michael, you are so right. And I would say one sign to, you know, when you need to do some intentional listening is when you have a meeting where everybody is quiet, and the minute the meeting is over and people are out of the room, you start talking. All right, so
I'm just doing like informal couch listening sessions. So I'm someone who can kind of get a read on what is going on in a congregation, in my own congregation. I do it in a way I think it's not too disruptive, but so I just sit next to people on the couch and say during coffee hour, I'm a slacker. I don't go to adult ed because I want to talk to people. So I sit on the couch in the gathering space and wait and see who comes over. And I feel like it's like God's in that too. Like I don't have to sit in adult Sunday school, but people sit down next to me on the couch and I'd say, well, what do you think about this? Like, what's going on? What, share your ideas. What do you think we should do? And it was very fascinating. It helped me get to know people better, but I feel like kind of surface some ideas. So
what Joy is sharing is kind of a personal pause for listening, where you can say, this is my time where I'm going to plank myself down and just talk to people. On a church-wide scale, what a pause for listening could look like is from leadership, so kind of a top-down saying, this is what we're doing and this is a good thing. We're going to focus on listening. Sometimes when people hear that listening is going to be happening, it generates anxiety because they don't know what's going to be said. Maybe this is new and strange to them. So hearing that this is something that leadership supports and is behind can help people feel more safe. You may want to scale back or even take a break from programming. So that might look like, for example, saying, for the month of April, not April, that's Easter. For the month of May, our Sunday school classes are going to be times where we're going to discuss things and listen to each other. Or it might be, we're going to take a break from our choir or our evening groups. And so Wednesday evenings for this period of time, make sure there's a start point and an end point, are going to be focused on listening. It could be that there's certain programs that are just not taking a listening break from those specific programs. And then planning times in a safe environment for sharing. And I think maybe we'll save that for Q&A about how to create safety around sharing, but just the importance of saying, this is a set thing. People feel safer when they know it's got structure to it. So we're going to give some sample questions. So it's like, okay, we're all geared up to do listening and ask questions, but now what do we ask? So we just want to walk through some potential areas that could be listening goals. So I'm going to give you 4 goals here with sample questions, and these are not by any means exhaustive, but they cover some ground that we think is important. So the first listening goal is just to check in with people and give them a chance to answer the question, how have you been doing? How's your family? And either that can be people sitting and talking to one another. It can be a large group setting. We're going to talk a little bit later about some specific listening activities, but the key is just really looking people in the eye and saying, how are you? And then giving them space to process and answer. How have you been seeing God at work through this time? Asking people what they're praying for about. A second goal might be building connections. And by the way, I invite you, if you've got other questions that you think would be really great to ask in any of these categories, pop your questions into the chat box, because Joy and I are always, we collect good questions. So we'd love to hear your suggested questions. So listening goal of building connections, of helping people in the church build relationships with one another, and having the church be, we call it like a relationship rich place. So questions might include, what are meaningful ways that people in the congregation have connected with you? What ideas do you have for how we can strengthen our relationships as a congregation, especially as we're coming back from COVID time? Asking people to tell stories is a great way of, sometimes if people get a little deer in the headlights if they're asked a direct question. but asking them to share a story can free up. So share a story about a time when you made a deeper connection or got to know somebody new. Third goal is getting people to talk about their ministries, experiences, passions, interests, the goals for the church. So what ideas do you have for engaging young adults? Joy and I just had a great conversation with a church leader about ideas for engaging millennials. What concerns or topics would you like to see our church address? What are new ways that our church could connect with the community? And we could go on and on and on. And then a fourth goal might be just getting people's feedback on a specific issue. So maybe something as specific as, what are your ideas for our renovation of our kitchen and fellowship area? Or it might be as broad as, what are your ideas for, do you have any ideas for for something we might try new as a church? So it can be very specific or very broad. Inviting people to share about times when they are most energized in their involvement of the church is a great way to figure out what gives people energy, and then energy begets energy. So I tend to stay away from questions that invite or generate a negative response. Not because it's not important to know, but in my experience, negativity doesn't need any help coming out. So if you frame the question, and there are exceptions to this, of course, but in general, if you frame the question as a positive, and people answer it, sometimes in their answering, if you push them a little harder, the negative stuff will come out. But framing it as not, so when are you least energized with the church? It might give you good information, but it also would be a real downer. And then finally, what is your prayer for our congregation? And that is going to make people really think. And that's another good byproduct of listening times.
Well, we're going to talk about 6 kinds of listening activities right now. So I'll talk about partner interviews and focus groups. Heidi's going to talk about like larger group dialogue, and table talk, and then and panel discussions, and I'll talk about creative input at the end. So there's lots of different ways to do this, and I find people often gravitate towards 1 or 2. So as you listen, just be thinking, which ones of these would work best in our congregation? Part of it depends on the size of the church, whether or not people are introverted or extroverted, you know, whether they are used to being in small group settings, I think, and enjoy that. So I really love partner interviews. So putting people together in pairs for short listening sessions. And I think it's good for encouraging new and deeper connections or intergenerational connections. So you're asking people to sit with someone they don't normally talk to, or someone they don't really know at all, and have a conversation. And you can provide them with some sample questions or with the actual list that they're going to work with. So I feel like it's kind of seeding the congregation for closeness, like greater closeness. So it's like you can put different people together, and it's like a new little plant will pop up right there, where they had this positive conversation and got to know each other better. So I think it's maybe seeding for further listening. And I think this is a really good method to use for introverts in particular, who might not find group interactions as enjoyable. Or, you know, if you have a lot of shy people in your congregation, just different than being introverted, maybe they'd open up more if they were doing one-on-one with somebody. Probably be another great method to use. I also love focus groups. So and people often think this is only for for-profit business opportunities, like, what kind of soap do you like? What do you think about this soap? One time I was in one, and I knew somebody was trying to recruit people for a focus group about water, bottled water, and I guess I kind of felt sorry for her, so I agreed to participate in it. And I didn't help very much because they kept saying, what does this taste like? And I'd say, water? You know, what does this water taste like? Water. Anyway, we're gonna ask more probing questions in these focus groups than that. I think 6 to 8 people is kind of a sweet spot. And you could do either a specific demographic or a cross section of people. I kind of like the cross section. We've got people in different stages of life, kind of an intergenerational group. So it's really rich, I think, when you'd have like youth in the group with seniors from your congregation to discuss a set of questions. So you've got to have it's really good for targeted input on a specific issue or idea. So we did these, I do stuff like this for free for my own church about every 3 years around the pastoral search. So really asking them questions about, you know, what's needed at our church next, and what are we looking for in a candidate, like to rank the most important skills and issues. Often these would be like 60 minutes, 90 minutes maybe. If people are really talking, and you need a facilitator and you also need a recorder. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you need somebody to take really good notes in a setting like this. And then you're going to pull them all together and read them and see what rises to the top. So if there's some issues that show up in every single focus group that's held, then you're going to pay attention to that.
Group dialogue is good for getting input or just checking in for people. It's kind of a little bit more, can be a little bit more informal than a focus group. And it could be with a ready-made group, such as a choir, as you see here in the picture, or Sunday school class, a Bible study. It could be, if you have a small congregation, it could be the whole congregation, or it could be the congregation divided into 2. So the size of the group is flexible. But one thing that's really key is, are people comfortable talking in a group? And so, as Joyce said, not everybody is comfortable sharing in a group setting. So you may need to pair group dialogue with interviews. So if somebody looks like they have something important to say, but they're not really sharing, maybe going up to that person afterwards and saying, you know, I was just wondering if you had anything to contribute, or saying, the perspective that you shared was really interesting and I'd like to hear more about it. But in general, to get a group to talk about something like, for example, you know, how is everybody doing with the new Sunday school setup? So say you've changed your Sunday school setup. So in our church, for example, we changed from Sunday school being before or after to the service and the Sunday school being before. And so I'm like, how's everybody doing with that? I mean, that's so simple and so informal, but if you don't ask, then you don't learn. You just hear about it later in the parking lot.
Yeah.
So maybe even some really obvious questions to put before a group. Or groups can be great at coming up with new ideas. If you say, okay, so if our church you had a blue sky to imagine something that we were going to do in the community in the summer, what would be some ideas? And just have this group brainstorming session. Or taking a group and just saying, you know, how is everybody doing?
And this is a photo of a choir, so that's an example of a kind of group, but you don't have to sing your responses.
Right. Although that would kind of make it more fun. And the thing about group dialogue is you can have fun with it. And you can go on to the next one. So related to this is a little bit more formal. This takes a little bit more preparation. And I'm just curious, show of hands, if anybody's had familiarity with the World Cafe model, use that for anything. And you can Google that, but it's not proprietary, so you don't have to like pay somebody to use this model. But essentially, it's getting a small group of people, getting a whole bunch of tables, just like you see in the picture, that can accommodate the size of your group. And so this is if you've got a larger group, you want to do something activity with like a whole congregation, and you get them into groups of 3 to 5 around a table, you can have a question that you set on the table, and then you talk about that question. And I've also seen this where if you really want to be gathering information, you have one person who stays at each table, whose assigned role is a note taker. Oh, thank you, Rebecca, for putting that in there. So Rebecca just put a link to the World Cafe model in the chat. So the note taker's job is they just listen and take notes about what the table said. Another way to do it is after the table has had a chance to discuss, then there's a sharing time where every table reports back, and then one person takes notes. So those are two different ways to do it. And then, so they have a time of talking about a question, and all the tables are talking about the same question. And then you take a symbol, it could be a bell or something, and everybody shuffles tables. So you're moving around and you're sitting with people that you haven't sat with before. And then you ask a different question. And those questions can be serious. It can be like, talk about your experiences during COVID. Have you, or what's the struggle, getting people to open about struggles in life, or what's a hope that you have for our community. It can also just be a getting to know you question, like if your life were a movie, which movie would it be and why? So these can be kind of fun getting to know you questions as well. When our church did this, a variation of this, they always did one, go back a second, they always did one fun question and then one serious question. And then at the end, it's often helpful to have a time of debriefing. So you can ask a question like, what's one thing you learned about somebody that you didn't know before? What's one new idea you heard tonight that kind of gets you going? What's one challenge that, now you want to learn more about? So having that debrief at the end can lift out a whole other layer of information and thinking. All right, so number 5 is panel discussion, story session. This is, this can be more formal or it can be more informal. And so an example again from our church, we had a woman who had gone through a kidney replacement surgery and had almost died. And we gave her time to share her story with the congregation on a Wednesday evening. So that's a story session. It could be, here's a panel of teachers in the congregation. So teachers, talk about what your experiences are like with teaching. What are you seeing in the schools? What are young people struggling with today? It can be older people. So here are octogenarians, a panel of octogenarians. So there's all kinds of creative combinations here, but the key is you have some people talking and then there's audiences listening. And it helps to have somebody who's the MC with the mic asking questions. One church did this with 7th graders. So how often do 7th graders get to talk about their lives with the whole and share their perspective with the whole church?
And then finally, we're talking about creative input. So this is inviting input via creative media. So you could do art installations, video booth, journaling, putting things up online. So I think it's good for encouraging vision and breaking out of ruts. So this is a blackboard wall, or what did you call it, Heidi? A chalkboard?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can use a whiteboard as well.
Yeah, we heard your story. So we're asking people a specific question or two and asking them to put up some responses to that. I did some things that weren't really listening at my church, but you could do it this way too. For these events, I have a lot of art in my house. You can probably tell. Well, this art up here. And we just did a warm your heart event at our church. We organized that and we were standing outside in 16-degree weather, roasting marshmallows over fire pits because we're from Minnesota. But we I put up a heart wall. It was all these grids with a lot of my heart art on it, but we gave people paper hearts and they could share something about someone or something they love, and they put it up. So that was a way of listening. We weren't asking them about specific issues at the church, but people of all ages took paper hearts and wrote on them and hung them up on the grid. So then everybody could see them. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about with creative input. I've never done a video booth, but that sounds super fun. So you could also ask people to make their own videos and have a place where they could post them. So yeah.
Yeah, another example of a church that was starting a community ministry discernment process. and they asked people to they had an artistic display of a tree at the front, and they just had a basket full of leaves, and people took a leaf and they could write what gifts they had to bring to community ministry and then tape it to the tree. And then when that art installation was done, they took all the leaves down and they could analyze it. So they could kind of categorize, here's where we're seeing the most areas of giftedness in our congregation.
I think a surprising number of people are visual. So we've done 4 visual displays like that. I've kind of instigated that at my church. We did one for All Saints that had a lot of my saint art on it, but people put up a saint in their life that they were grateful for. And I learned a lot about people at my church from looking at those, like relatives who were significant to them. One family had their grandson took his own life during COVID, so they put up some things about him. I didn't know anything about that. So anyway, I think, and I've had people tell me the visuals were really important to me. We haven't really had that, but it helped me process things in like a different way than if I just got a report, and I was reading it. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Rebecca just pointed out that this doesn't have to be an event. It can be something that's ongoing.
Yep. And so we want to encourage you to have broad participation in whatever listening activities you choose. So you probably have a few super verbal people, the squeaky wheels, for good or for ill, in your church, or maybe the core group. You want to invite people that maybe aren't usually talking or expressing their opinions to make sure that they're there too. So I say the unusual suspects, don't just have the usual suspects, have the unusual suspects. And then seek representation from various types. So I have this group here, and they're of all different ages and ethnicities, and looks like walks of life. Make sure you include some youth, make sure you include some parents, some seniors, people who are involved in different kinds of ministry at the church. And then importantly, plan a variety of times and formats. So I did one of these with a church in a town in Indiana, a Lutheran church of about 200 people, and we had choir was a big deal. So we did some groups before and after choir because people were going to be in the building anyway. Quilting was a big deal. So we did one with the quilting group, a focus group is what I'm talking about. Plan some activities, and the kids were interviewing each other at youth group. So, and then we had some during the day things for people who were retired and maybe didn't want to go out at night. So anyway. And then, you really want a variety of people participating. So think about including both newer and longtime attendees. So when I do processes like this for strategic planning at churches, I always have a group of newer people, and I ask them what was it like to kind of break in here? Like, what was it like when you first arrived here on your first Sunday? What happened to you? What did people say to you? And that's a very interesting conversation to have. Youth and young adults, I think people who attend occasionally, or if people are homebound, we don't see them with their eyes every Sunday, but they're still participating because they're online. And those that are most affected by changes or new plans. So if you're going to change the time of Sunday school, which is a huge change in the life of a church, I have learned, who's going to be most affected by that? Probably people with, if you're going to do it earlier, people with little kids, right? So other people who would be affected, you definitely want to talk to them.
Throw in this suggestion here that these kinds of listening activities can also be a way to engage the community. So Joy and I talk about doing listening in the community, but also listening that kind of can be a bridge between the congregation and the community. So that might look for example, if you're doing a World Cafe style table talk about dealing with an issue, responding to an issue or need in the community, that you can open that up and invite people to share. And so you don't know if who's sitting around the table, might be a church member, might be someone just living in the community, but they're on equal ground talking about issues together. It might look like having a summer festival where you have that video booth and invite people to share about one thing I love about living here, or who's my hero in my life, or other question like that. So it's kind of an equalizer and gets people sharing with one another. So we're not gonna, that's not the focus here. We have lots of ideas, but we just wanted to throw this in here and maybe get your thoughts spinning too about how this, you could open up listening as an outreach. Joy says we had the heart wall up for 3 weeks at our church, so people could add a heart anytime they were in the church building. And you don't have to be a member to add a heart, right, Joy? I mean, anybody can.
Right. I mean, the youth actually interacted with the displays a lot, which pleased me. So they would youth nights on Wednesday nights, so they took hearts and put. So there would be new ones up first thing on Sunday morning because they'd been there and looking. So anyway, I'm passionate about art and kind of participatory art, so this was a good use of me during this time.
Yeah, and I want to say that we had an experiment in our congregation. Is a lot of listening, as you can hear it, and some things work and some things don't. So we tried an intergenerational curriculum where we had tables where, you know, intentionally there were older people, like younger families, and kids all sitting at the table answering questions. The younger kids liked it. The teenagers hated it. They were like, we don't want to sit and talk to a bunch of old people and little kids. But I think that they would kind of go for some of these more creative things, or things where it's more active. They just didn't like sitting next to a grandma. I'll say it this way, my teenager don't like to sitting next to a grandma and hearing grandma talk about her life. But so there are ways of engaging youth, and some of them might work, some of them might not. So we're asking you to put in the chat box what you've tried, what's worked for you, or what are you most interested in trying?
Well, and at our church, the visuals worked well too in our multi-ethnic congregation, because there's a language barrier for some of the Quran. So they were able to put up, you know, their national hero, who was a martyr, on our wall of saints. And then they wrote about things about him in Quran in English. So then we could all be like, I didn't know about that guy before, but I need to know about him. And same with the hearts, like people put up hearts in the Quran language, so that other Quran people could read those.
Mm-hmm. So Michael asked, do you have any advice for how to politely ask the people who tend to take charge, who take charge of everything, have all the answers, to take a back seat? We appreciate and need the take charge servant leaders, but too often newcomers or passive people do not feel they can compete. Yeah, we're going to do some troubleshooting toward the end, but I think having this toolbox here is helpful, because if you do partner interviews and the take charge people are assigned to ask questions, then that puts them in the role of listener, or at least they can only monopolize conversation with one person, not a whole group. If it's a panel, for example, with the moderator kind of controls the time, or, you know, you kind of put the take charge people in the audience and you put the people who don't always share that as much up front. Same with a focus group, you can kind of control who's around the table. So
yeah, I think focus groups are a great way if you have, well, and I'll talk in a minute about how to help people dial down in a group setting if they need.
Rebecca shares, I did a worship series, and each Sunday I had one question that people would answer, and the blocks helped us build an image of our church building over the 6 weeks. How cool. So input and visual. I use the reflections and sermons and prayers. And I think, Rebecca, what I like there is not only the creativity, but then the responsiveness that you're showing, that you actually paid attention to what people said and incorporated that feedback. Love the idea of art and visual representations of feelings and interests. Sorry, Joy. And what gets individuals excited, etc.
Well, then you feel like, with what Rebecca said, you're building something. You know, this isn't just like random listening that gets shoved in a drawer, but like we're making something together. So it's the visual of that.
Oh, cool.
So getting started on this, we think it's a great idea to do have a listening team of 4 to 6 people, and they can kind of help set up activities, might be facilitators if you're doing focus groups. I find they're great to promote the idea of doing listening. So probably you want a couple people that are well loved in the congregation and who everybody looks to, or people who are just so excited about everything they pull everyone in. Like I have a couple friends like that at church. And then I'm like, why am I substitute teaching a children's Sunday school class? Oh, it's because Lori asked me. So you want some people like that. Anything else you would add on a listening team, Heidi?
Yeah, I know we have some more roles on the next slide.
Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so you definitely want some facilitators, and you're gonna, in group settings, they're gonna follow like an agenda or a series of questions. So I always encourage people to not go off script, kind of stick to the questions in a group setting. I think when you're doing one-on-one interviews, you might go more in depth with somebody, on something they bring up about their life. You need note takers. So people that are great at, and I always say, take notes as closely as you can to word for word. So I find with focus groups for sure, something that someone's saying that doesn't seem to make sense at the time, and I look at it later and I'm like, that's like really profound. It's like one of the most important things that was said at the evening. People who can kind of organize and take on the hospitality role. People are going to invite people to participate, so people need to be invited to like group sessions. And then creative types, like how are we going to advertise this? How are we going to communicate about it? Anyway, so those are some of the team roles.
And Rebecca asked a question, is it better for these leaders to be board leaders, pastors, or is it helpful for other people to have these roles that aren't in other leadership roles? Joy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the pastor needs to talk about this and endorse it. So wherever people are listening, whether it's the weekly email or from the pulpit on Sunday or whatever it is on social media, pastor needs to say, look, this is coming and you need to get over here and participate in it because it's amazing. So the priest at my church is my longtime friend of like 30 years. So I send him words to say like on Sundays and put on social media, like, you do not want to miss this event. We're going to be roasting marshmallows in the freezing cold. So, and then you need to decide on a few things as a team. So what's the goal of the listening? We want to get information. We want, get information about something specific. We want people to connect in a new way. We want to promote intergenerational relationships. The scope, like, do we want to invite everyone in the church to participate in this, or is this mainly for youth and their parents? So that's an example. What kind of activities and methods would work best at your church? Is it more the one-on-one, or do you think small groups might be better, or maybe big group activities? And then most importantly, like, how are you going to communicate this? So I always say at church, you have to say, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Here it is, and then there it was. So, I mean, it's this kind of lead up and then, so yeah, I find that really letting people know what to expect. If you're going to be doing this after church with lunch or something, you got to make sure people know about that. Or if you need people to sign up to come on, weeknights to focus groups, have that articulated really clearly and make it easy for people to sign up.
I want to say something more about Rebecca's question, and I think a lot depends on whether the leaders feel overloaded already,
Yeah.
because if you put people on a team who are already exhausted, probably stuff's not going to get done. But you don't want to have a team that gets ideas and then isn't empowered. So you want at least one decision maker or gatekeeper on your team.
That's a good point. I like that.
I would also say that your team it's wise to have some representation from the group. So, to decide on your scope and goals. So if your goal is to talk to youth, maybe put a youth on your listening team so that they can be shaping how you listen. Another thing that's really important to do. So now we talked about what you do before you listen. Now we're going to talk about what you do after you listen. So debrief, not necessarily be brief, but debrief. So debriefing to compare your notes and prayerfully reflect on the experience. this is where a lot of the kind of creative thinking happens. And this also involves your team. So in a congregational listening process, the team has put in a lot of work and a lot of time in listening to people. They've taken a lot of notes, but then maybe one person may have heard something and then but another person heard something else. And to create a set time, like, so you've had this amazing focus group experience, but then your team has to come back and talk about it, because that's where the kind of juices are going to flow, and where you're going to process it, and where the different giftedness on the team is they're going to kind of work off of each other. And that leads to the next slide, which is finding all the treasures. So you're going to have this mound of information, maybe especially if you're like trying to get input on a specific question. So you're going to have a lot of quotes. And how do you distill from that what the key ideas are? So as Joy mentioned earlier, you look for recurring themes. So if you have 3 different listening activities and kind of a similar theme is being lifted up at each activity, that tells you that this is something that's really important. I think people often have just some intuition too, spiritual discernment. So maybe not everybody was saying it, but maybe just one person, sometimes the quietest person, said something. And in your debrief session and your analysis, you lift that up and everybody's like, oh, yes, that is the Spirit speaking. We need to listen to that. Pay a special attention to discoveries about gifts and needs. Because these are the nuggets. And then you're going to think about how do you share these insights with the congregation. So as Joyce said, it's important to tell people what's coming. It's important to tell people what's happening, but then also important to tell them about what happened. And if you do a listening activity and you have a big ramp up to it and then silence, people are going to feel let down.
Yeah.
So there needs to be some kind of communication about these. So we heard from a lot of you that our kids are a key value in this congregation. We heard from a lot of people that our sound system could really use some work, and we're going to be paying attention to that. That's the kind of feedback that people. You don't need to like a 10-page report. Just give them the nuggets. And then we encourage you to invite feedback from the congregation. So you're gonna have to listen about listening. So if you did a focus group, just check in with the people. Hey, how'd that work for you? Was this a good experience for you? Did any questions make you feel uncomfortable? Or what were you, what are you, and having gone through this listening, what are you excited about now? So get feedback, because there always will be a next time.
So just a few tips for fruitful listening. Pray about it. Pray that it goes well. I always pray that people are honest and kind as they're talking. And that real connections will be made between people. Make it fun. I think having some food there makes a lot of sense. Like I said, make sure you're writing down everything that's said as close as you can. Because things that you think, what is that? Look at it later and it'll be like, no, that was really profound. And then following up on needs and ideas. So I like sometimes during the asking the more personal questions or like needs that your family has, and you found out that a lot of more people were unemployed in your congregation than you knew about. So that would warrant having a conversation among the staff and the church leaders about what can we do to support people during this challenging time. And then some self-care for the listening team. Do you want to say a word about that, Heidi?
Sometimes it's not always easy what you hear, especially if your prayer for people to be honest is answered.
Yeah.
And sometimes, so it could be things that you don't want to hear personally, and it's hard, for people not, especially if you have leaders on the team, not to take that personally. And so the team may need to kind of like do a group hug, not literally, but a spiritual group hug, and support one another and say, yes, this was hard. Some things came to the surface that maybe we didn't want to hear, but we're going to support one another because this was still important, that we heard it, even though it was hard. And I think especially if you've got introverts on your team, their self-care is going to be, okay, now I'm going to go, we just had this really intense session. Now I'm going to go away and you're not going to hear from me. And don't bother me for the next 10 hours because I need to be an introvert and recover.
We talked about communicating already. So really you need to over communicate throughout the process because people will think nothing's happening if you don't talk about it. So you can say something like, hey, we held 5 focus groups in the last week. And we're working on looking at the results and we'll let you know. Send you some bullet points about what we found out. And then troubleshooting. So it's like, sometimes
you step in it.
Well, and I don't, any one of us, I think, could be one of these people, depending on the day or what kind of situation we're in. But some people really like to monopolize meetings, and you have to just pay attention if you're the facilitator and say, it sounds like you have a lot of ideas on this issue, and I do need to hear from everyone here. So could I arrange a time to talk to you one-on-one so I can make sure I capture your concerns or what you're interested in here? People usually respond well to that. Or if I know the person well, I'll just be like, look at this. Zip your lip, or just say something funny to them and they'll usually get it. Shocker, some people kind of like to take a group off topic by saying something that's going to make people go, and sometimes I just say, well, we're not really talking about that right now, but if you want to write down some of your thoughts on that, I can certainly look at it and we can talk about it later. And to reemphasize, this is not about having a debate. We're not trying to smack down and win. So we're just surfacing ideas. So if people start refuting what other people are saying, you really need to nip that in the bud. Critics, kind of the same thing, and I think phrasing the questions with positive language helps a lot on that. And then recognizing that people have really been through trauma during this time. So I think maybe allowing a little more space for listening, but again, saying, I hear that. I mean, this has obviously been really painful for everybody, this particular thing. And maybe if we want to stay after, we can sit and talk about that a little bit more. But I think it's important to, in a focus group setting or a group setting, you're dealing with probably not a lot of questions. So it might be 5 in a focus group. So you want to make sure you get through the questions in every group. And you might just need to talk to people afterwards or kind of steer the conversation around some of these issues.
So deep breath as we get toward the end of this presentation, and we've had a lot of ideas, and I would really love to sit down and just have a conversation with all of you about how this is landing. But my guess is that somebody might be feeling like this is like a steak and I just want a snack, or this is an elephant and I want a peanut. And so I really encourage starting with baby steps, and that any listening is good. One of the things that we always encourage a listening team to do is to practice on yourselves. So try out the questions, because sometimes a question might sound good to yourself or make sense, and then somebody asks you and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense at all, or I don't know how to answer that question. So do that helps you kind of do a trial run. So that's good for listening. And also you learn something about your teammates. And so you kind of bond together as a team if you do that, listen to one another first. Also, you can start with groups that already have a good bond. So maybe the first time you just start with your small group, people that you've known and met with every week for 10 years, and do some intentional listening there. This one is my favorite, which is embedding listening in a fun activity. Joy and I are deep believers in fun. Especially in this season of life, we need our fun. And fun activities like a picnic or a game night, or just make your own pizza. And then while the pizza is cooking in the oven, you can do a listening activity. Or after you play your games, you can, or if you have like a youth festival, there can be a booth where people can go and answer these questions. I'm just kind of talking off the top of my head here, but you can see that there are all kinds of ways to mix in fun with listening. And if you're really anxious about what listening might uncork in your congregation, start with safe topics. Start with something even maybe a little silly, just to get people talking, just to get them used to the idea that that we're going to sit down and have a conversation. And I think no matter how well you know somebody, you can always get to know them better. So our kind of summary is, after you've done all this listening, what next? What happens next? What do you do with what you've heard? And I hesitate to say this again because we want to be really sensitive to the season of life we're in, that people are tired, people don't have a lot of bandwidth, and even if they get a great idea, sometimes it's just not possible right now to run with it. But it could be that maybe this sparks a new ministry idea of the person in the congregation that you ask the question to. Mm-hmm. So a friend of mine, somebody asked him, if time and money were no object, what would you see yourself doing in 5 years? And he realized at that point that God had put a call on his life to do single parent ministry. And that sparked a whole career and a very rich ministry of doing ministry with single parent families from somebody asking him that question. So you don't feel like you have to control or do all the work of follow-up, because this is going to spark things and the Spirit will move. It can uncover conflicts or issues or needs that you have to address. And that's the gift of the critic, the gift of the naysayer, is they say things that everybody's thinking, but nobody wants to talk about. But those needs and issues are there under the surface. And so whether you talk about them or not. So that can be a gift as well. Identifying what members are passionate about. So maybe people are not as frequent attenders because that's not the bandwidth that people only have limited bandwidth, and they want to spend their limited time and energy on things that they really care about. So when you tap into that, you might say, this ministry that nobody's showing up for, maybe we can put that program aside and open this new door to a ministry that people really care about. And that might unleash some participation. Learning life stories and giftings, developing better connection, engaging new people. So spending time actually listening to somebody. Maybe this is their first Sunday at your church, and then they have this whole conversation, and you listen to them, and they're like, wow, this is a place where I want to be because this is where I feel heard. And it will strengthen your church life. You'll hear ideas and feedback that will make doing what you do better. So this is where we throw it back to you to say what most energizes you about listening in your congregation, and what might be a good way for you to start. So what baby steps or elephants might you be excited about? So encourage you to take a moment and write at least one idea of something you want to try in the chat box. Joy, is there anything you want to add about the gift of listening to a congregation? Or how a team might want to follow up?
I want to see what people put in the chat first, I think. We've been talking for a long time. Now I want to listen to what people are going to say. So. Listening to the youth. I like the fun and food idea, Carolyn said. Last time I did a series of focus groups at my own church, I sat down with like the 14-year-olds, and they said more profound things than anyone else in the whole focus group process. And I think part of it is they're just being super honest. And we have a focus on spiritual development for everyone at our church. They had these like deeply spiritual comments, and they wanted more spiritual development. I was like, man. So anyway. I think the phase where here we go. We have 3 generations in our church, and I would like to try 2 things: partner interviews to pair older with younger, and panel discussions, story sessions to give a voice to people whose voices and stories are seldom heard.
Oh,
What
I
a
love that.
beautiful idea.
That's
I
powerful.
love that, yeah. We did a series in our church about those 4 people, stories of people who've been through really traumatic things. And it was before COVID, and each family got one Sunday, and it was like a 4-week series. And that was profound, just to hear how God was speaking to them in the midst of cancer. We have friends who had a micro preemie baby who almost didn't make it, but he's doing well. He's going to be 5 this year. Yes, I don't know if that's what you're talking about when we're talking. I mean, those sharing some really deep things that have happened to people.
I think the one-on-one will work best for our very small church. We have no children, and people want to talk about what we can do to get young families back.
Yeah, an activity that allows the congregation to let down their guard before tapping into ideas, concerns, what they think is working well or not. Sure. So start out with some kind of light questions, maybe.
After COVID, I would love to let people share the stories of what they've experienced and missed the opportunities to share over these 2 years. Maybe a creative input idea. Yeah, and the other good thing about creative input is it lets people distance themselves a little. So if they're sharing something that's very difficult, putting it in writing or recording it or drawing a picture about it or whatever is easier than saying, yeah, my family went through this. Just verbalizing it can be difficult for people.
Do we get everybody?
Yeah, and the idea about panel discussions to give a voice to people whose voices and stories are seldom heard. If your congregation has an issue, has a particular issue that you care about, or you've done ministry, say you've had a food pantry, or you send money to a homeless shelter, or you want to tackle an issue, starting by hearing people's stories is really powerful because it puts the connection to a person and a face rather than just an issue.
I find that's worked best, the storytelling with our Karen members. Because I feel like there's not just language differences, but cultural differences. So I sit down with a group of Karen teens, me, and I'm saying things like, what do you think about that? Or what would you do differently? Or like asking all the regular focus group questions. They were just like, because for them, it's impolite. We're like the host country. It's impolite for them to express any displeasure or, differing opinions. But putting them in groups, like mixed group settings to talk about what it was like. You're in refugee camps for a really long time, what it was like coming here, what it's been like for them to be at our church, what they value the most. Just telling their stories has been really powerful. I learned a lot. So.
Anybody have any burning questions, something that we didn't cover?
And we can do more questions in a second. We wanted you to know that we're consultants and trainers, so could work with your churches or a group of your churches on these issues. So we do training to strengthen connections. So these are some of the topics. So like I said at the beginning, if you've said we're friendly here, but we don't really know each other. So how would we develop strategies at our church so we could get to know each other in here, but also get to know people in our community better? And then we're working with leadership teams on these things. So it's around community ministry. So it's another niche that we have. So looking at vision, your assets. We help facilitate community listening processes. And something always comes out of those that you don't expect. So I'm getting ready to do 2, and it's like, right now, 1 local and 1 in another state. And it's fascinating because there's always some things that come out that you didn't expect. And then part of that is developing ministry partnerships too. But I think if you've got an idea about community ministry, we help churches do some planning around that and figure out how they can engage their members. So yeah, any other questions? So you could just, I think our emails are here. Yeah. So you could email one of us if you want to start a conversation on that. And we like working with cohorts. So 2 or 3 of your churches want to do some training together or something, that's definitely possible. And in the age of Zoom, even more so. So.
Well, I am excited by the ideas that have been shared. They're all very doable, and I trust that they will lead you to places of excitement, places of openness, maybe some places of pain, but a good kind of pain, pain of empathy with those who are hurting, and openness to hearing God's Spirit.
Amen. Those are good words to close us out. Anything you want to add, Rebecca?
I'm just thankful that you guys came on, and it was good to have you with us. There's a lot of great ideas. I think I didn't have any questions because I feel like you thought ahead of what the questions might be and you already answered them. So
Well, people had great chat comments too.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So, but it was really lovely to have both of you share this with us, and yeah, it's great. I hope everybody has a great night.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night, everybody.
Good night.
Blessings.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you so
and
much.
Heidi, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone.
Say hello to South Africa for us.
Of course, I'll share the love.
And wherever the rest of you are equally important.